In the history of Sufism and Islamic intellectual/mystical thought, there are few figures as famous and influential as the Arabic Andalusian Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, also known as the Sheikh al-Akbar, the greatest master. A polarizing figure in the Islamic world, he has been considered everything from the greatest saint and spiritual master in history to a dangerous heretic. The life and thought of Ibn Arabi is fascinating, and if you want to know more about it, then you can check out my full episode on that topic. But the school that he became associated with, the Akbari school, or the Akbariya, named after his title as the Sheikh al-Akbar, the greatest master, became associated with a certain doctrine known as Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity or the oneness of being, although he actually never used that term himself. This is a complicated and often misunderstood idea where God stands as the sole reality, as wujud or existence itself, and everything else only being a reflection or manifestation of God's attributes. It is with these ideas that Ibn Arabi made his mark in the world of Sufism and mysticism. His books are still read and studied today and contain some of the most puzzling and yet beautifully intricate expressions of mystical experience and the various dimensions of the Islamic religion. And indeed, Ibn Arabi was a prolific writer, producing a ridiculous amount of books and treatises over his life, everything from Sufi poetry, like his collection of mystical love poems, the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, to philosophical commentaries and mystical prose. Perhaps the most central and intimidating of his works, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Revelations, spans over 10,000 pages in the original Arabic and functions as a kind of vast compendium of all aspects of the Islamic religion, from law to spiritual practice and various different sciences. But another, shorter work from late in his life serves as perhaps the most famous, or maybe infamous, and controversial of his writings. What some would consider the crown jewel of his literary output and a masterpiece of mystical prose, the Fusus al-Hikam, often translated as the ringstones of wisdom or the bezels of wisdom. Ibn Arabi was originally from Andalusia, specifically from Murcia in eastern Spain, but he grew up for the most part in and around Sevilla, which was the capital of the Almohad Caliphate at that time. Eventually, he entered the mystical path under several teachers, had intense visions and illuminations, he traveled widely in the region and started writing mystical works. Some of these early works survive for us today, like the Mashahid al-Asrar, the Ittihad al-Kawni, the Anqa Maghrib, just being a few examples. Eventually, however, he left his homeland of Andalusia and the Maghrib, and around the turn of the 13th century, he traveled to the east during the Hajj to Mecca, visiting the great cities of Jerusalem, Baghdad, Konya, and Cairo. And toward the end of his life, he settled in the city of Damascus, where he raised his family and continued being a significant and respected Sufi teacher and master until his death, probably in the year 1240. And it is toward the end of this relatively long and very eventful life, around 1230, that he composed the Fusus al-Hikam. Or actually, he claims that he didn't necessarily compose it at all. In the introduction to the work, he claims that he had a vision of the Prophet Muhammad, who handed him the book and told him to give it to the people, and then he preserved it unchanged, basically. In other words, Ibn Arabi considers this book to come directly from the Prophet and to contain some of the most exalted secrets of religion and reality. Now, as we said, Ibn Arabi produced a lot of writings, but the Fusus does hold a special place in his output. Not only is it one of the last, if maybe not the last, full work that he produced beginning to end, thus representing a kind of doctrinal culmination and highest maturation of his thought and ideas, the crown jewel of his output, as some have said, but we can also see indications of its special status due to how it was treated. You see, when Ibn Arabi wrote his works, he would often hold a listening session, what's known as a sama, so not to be confused with the Sufi ritual of listening to music. In this case, sama means that he would, or one of his disciples perhaps, would read aloud his works to an audience as a sort of first public performance or reading of the book, basically. And the different books of Ibn Arabi was aimed at different audiences. And we can see from the records of these Sama sessions that different books would have different audiences depending probably on the nature of the book. So the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which was a book that was aimed to a very large audience, there were a lot of people there, his disciples were there, but also a vast amount of different kinds of people. And what's really interesting is that when it comes to the Fusus al-Hikam, for the Sama or reading session of this book, only one person was present, and that was Sadruddin al-Qunawi, his closest student and even stepson. So this says something really significant about this work, that it is so it contains the sort of deepest teachings in a way that only his closest disciple was in attendance at the reading of this book. So this is clearly a very special and difficult text, only meant for the most advanced students on the mystical path, and here we are talking about it on YouTube. But this is also probably why it is the most controversial and well-known of his works, since he speaks very plainly, very directly and without filters, making the statements and ideas very easy to misunderstand unless you know how to interpret them. And many people did indeed misunderstand and were horrified with what was said in the book. A famous example is the 14th century Hanbali theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, who tells us that he was initially actually a fan of Ibn Arabi after reading some of his works, including the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, but when he read the Fusus, his opinion changed completely, and Ibn Taymiyyah from that moment became one of Ibn Arabi's greatest critics, accusing him of heresy. So there's clearly something about this book, right? The work is relatively short, especially compared to some of his other ones, but it is packed with incredibly dense mystical prose and poetry, radical expressions, and the formulation of Ibn Arabi's most daring ideas, including that which is often called Wahdat al-Wujud, but also related ideas like the temporary nature of suffering in hell, the faith of Pharaoh in the story of Moses, and the so-called Divinity of Beliefs, all of which we will explore in our exploration of this book. It is divided into 27 chapters, each being a fas, a ringstone or bezel of a certain wisdom and associated with one of the Quranic/biblical prophets. So for example, the first chapter is the ringstone or fas of divine wisdom, so the wisdom of divinity, in the word of Adam. The second is the ringstone of the wisdom of breathing in the word of Seth, etc. Each chapter revolves around a prophet and often includes interpretations of stories about those prophets from the Quran and the Bible, and what those stories can tell us about the doctrines of unity and oneness, for example. The chapters in this sense also follow a kind of loose chronological order, starting with Adam and then ending with Muhammad. But this chronological order isn't always consistent. For example, like both Jesus and Solomon are before the chapter of David, which doesn't make sense. So it's not a strictly chronological order, but in a very general sense, you could see it. You could see that kind of historical chronology unfolding across the 27 chapters. It's also quite strange to me that there are 27 chapters in particular. Why do I say this? Well, because Ibn Arabi is always very careful about the significance of numbers and letters and all these correspondences. And when it comes to Sufism and all these values and numbers, the number 28 is one of the most recurring ones. There are 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet, there are 28 mansions of the moon, etc. And these correspondences between all these numbers is very significant to people like Ibn Arabi. And as an example, Ibn Arabi wrote a lot of poetry, right? But he wrote most of that poetry in classical Arabic forms like qasida. He did, however, write a kind of suite of Andalusian style poems, both in terms of the style. It's in muwashah and zajal forms, which was a style of poetry and song that was born in Andalusia at around this time. And so these songs are written by Ibn Arabi, and there are in total 28 of them. There is 27 muwashah poems, and 1 zajal poem. And that last song or poem, the zajal one, is also structured within itself in a peculiar way. It is divided into 7 stanzas of 4 lines each. And what does 4 times 7 give us? 28, of course, right? And each one also represents, the 4 lines represents the 4 sides of the Kaaba, and 7 is, of course, you do tawaf, you turn around the Kaaba 7 times. So a lot of this symbolism of number is very significant to Ibn Arabi, in particular the number 28. We see this all across his thought, for example, in this way. And then the Fusus has 27 chapters. Why doesn't it have 28? I lose sleep over this sometimes. I just don't know what's going on with this missing chapter, and it feels like something so out of character of him to sort of leave that out in this case. I can't help but think there's something significant going on with this missing chapter, or maybe I'm just crazy. I haven't been able to find an answer, at least from the research that I've been doing, but maybe there are scholars out there who have already answered this question. Maybe it's obvious and I just haven't realized it, but that's one of the weird things to me about this book. So that's the general outline and background of the book, but what does it actually say? What's in this book? Well, let's explore one of the most profound books of mysticism in history. While the work covers an impossibly broad spectrum of concepts and visions of reality, it all boils down to the relationship between God, or the real, and the world of appearance, and also the central role that the human being plays in this tapestry of reality. As we said, the basic idea of what is called the unity of being, which arguably the work explores to a major degree, is that God is all there is. There is only God, and the Islamic proclamation of faith, La ilaha illallah, is read to mean essentially that there is no reality but the real, or God. But this is not meant in a crude pantheistic sense, right? God is not identical to the world, but always remains utterly transcendent of the world at the same time, while simultaneously being its very reality in every way. This is a paradox that is explored again and again from different angles in the Fusus. Essentially, the world of creation, so all of the cosmos, that which is, quote, other than God, is a manifestation or appearance of the infinite attributes and names of God in limited form. I sometimes summarize it by saying that the cosmos is, quote, the unfolding of possibilities inherent in infinite actuality. So as the Quran says, whichever way you turn, there is the face of God, while simultaneously God remains hidden and transcendent at the same time. In the book, Ibn Arabi uses various similes and metaphors to explain this. One of my favorites being the different uses of the mirror metaphor. The essence of God, or the that of God in Arabic, remains hidden and inaccessible while being the very reality of all things. It's like looking into a mirror, the mirror of being, or wujud, and seeing all these images in the mirror. The images are God insofar as they are manifestations of his attributes in limited forms, so mirrorings of the names of God. But it is also the images in the mirror, so being the world in other words, that veils us from seeing the very surface of the mirror itself. So here the surface is God's essence, or wujud, being itself. The images are only reflections of that wujud. It's not the same as that wujud in a certain sense, but it's also the images of the world that we experience that veils the very surface of the mirror itself, because we never see the surface of a mirror, we only see the images. This is a very powerful simile that he uses. He says, when you see a form in a mirror, struggle within yourself to see the body of the mirror. You will, without any doubt, never see it. So God veils himself with himself. We'll return to these themes a bit later on too. But the human being, especially the complete human being, which is known as the Insan al-Kamil, as a cosmic archetype or logos principle, is probably one of the key themes of Ibn Arabi's thought and the Fusus in particular. And this becomes apparent especially in the very opening chapter on the word of Adam, who represents mankind as a whole. In fact, the opening line or section of the entire work summarizes in very simple terms a significant chunk of what the rest of the work elucidates, basically. So the very first words in the first chapter of the Fusus says, quote, The real-willed, glorified be he, in virtue of his beautiful names, which are innumerable, to see their identities, if you so wish, you can say to see his identity, in a comprehensive being that comprises the whole affair, insofar as it is possessed of existence, and his mystery is manifest to himself through it. For the vision a thing has of itself in itself is not like the vision a thing has of itself in another thing, which would be like a mirror for it. Indeed, he is manifest to himself in a form accorded by the locus seen, which would not have manifested to him without the existence of that locus and his self-disclosure to it. Now there's a lot going on in this paragraph. To begin with, as we have discussed in earlier videos about Ibn Arabi, there is a hadith Qudsi that is very central to his thought, namely the one where God says, quote, "I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known, so I created the world that I might be known." God, in his essence, or the that, his absolute form, so to say, is completely unknowable and beyond any attribution or description. No qualities or attributes can be ascribed to it, and we can say absolutely nothing about it other than that it is. The name of God that Ibn Arabi likes to use when referring to this absolute essence of God is al-Haq, which means literally the real or the truth. And this is the name that he uses in that very first line. The real-willed, glorified be he in virtue of his beautiful names, which are innumerable. This apophatic essence of God, the real, has a hidden treasure, namely the names and attributes that are ascribed to him. But at this point or level, the names are not separate concepts at all, because there is only the one essence. But as the hadith says, the real wants, or even loves, فَأَحْبَبْتُ, for his treasure to be known. So this leads to something happening. God entifies himself. In order to create something, God must become more entified or qualified in stages. The first step of this, called at-tayun al-awwal, the first entification, is a kind of self-knowledge where God knows his own nature, thus introducing a kind of duality between the knower and the known. And what does God know about himself? Well, of course, the infinite attributes and qualities that are the hidden treasure, and all the ways that those attributes and names can manifest themselves. And we see this in that first line of the Fusus, where the beautiful names are called innumerable, right? So there are infinite names, infinite attributes of God, and God knows these attributes and names as he begins knowing himself. He always knows himself, of course, in the essence, but there's a new level of knowing introduced at this first entification, where he knows himself as these attributes and qualities, right? He becomes more qualified, and this is the first stage in that process. What happens, as the hadith suggests, is that God creates the cosmos, that which is other than God, as a way for himself to be known to himself, but through another. The cosmos, in its infinity of possibilities, changes, and developments over time, is nothing but the manifestation in limited form of those infinite attributes and qualities inherent in the divine essence. The whole cosmos is therefore a reflection of God, like in a mirror. And I'm not talking here about only the physical cosmos at this particular moment in time, but all the possible worlds, material and immaterial, for all time, extending in the past and in the future, and even beyond. But the whole cosmos as such reflects all the attributes of God. That is the macrocosm. But the same process is also true of the microcosm, that is the human being. Just as the entire cosmos reflects all the attributes in a kind of spread out way, you could say, the microcosm, the human being, Adam in this case, right? He also reflects all the attributes of God, but in a comprehensive and kind of unified form, at least in potential, right? Not that every single human being is perfectly reflecting all the attributes at all time, but in potential, the human being, the insan al-kamil, right? This logos principle, which also is the potential of every human being, that reflects all the names and attributes of God, but in a comprehensive way. So this is once again that idea of the macrocosm mirroring the microcosm that we find in so many traditions, and it is very much present here in Ibn Arabi. So this is the basic situation. The world is a mirror reflecting the attributes of God in being, where the human being plays a central role as the microcosmic reflection not only of the macrocosm, but of the very divine itself. So now let's read that first section again with all of this in mind. Quote, "The real willed, glorified be he, in virtue of his beautiful names, which are innumerable, to see their identities." If you so wish, you can say to see his identity, because even though the names and attributes of God are many, they are really only different ways and relationships to a single thing, right? It's all of it is just God. There's just one being, one reality, even though we call it by all these different names and attributes, and these attributes are different relationships to the created world. There's only one being. So to say that he wanted to see their identities, as in the names, is the same thing as saying he wanted to see his identity in singular, right? That's what he's saying here. He wanted to see their identities, if you so wish, you can say to see his identity, in a comprehensive being that comprises the whole affair insofar as it is possessed of existence, and his mystery is manifest to himself through it. This reflection, right, that we talked about. For the vision a thing has of itself in itself is not like the vision a thing has of itself in another thing, which will be like a mirror for it. Indeed, he is manifest to himself in a form accorded by the locus seen, which would not have manifested to him without the existence of that locus and his self-disclosure to it. So again, right, this says a lot. He starts with a bang here, as you can see. And already here we've been introduced to some of the key concepts and ideas that he will further elaborate on and expand upon in dazzling ways all throughout this book. For example, the second chapter dedicated to Seth, one of Adam's sons, goes deeper into the concept called the Ayan al-Thabita, which is also very central to his system. Remember that we said that as God sort of metaphorically turns to himself and knows himself, he knows his infinite attributes and qualities in a unified way. Well, because these attributes are infinite, God also knows the infinite ways that these attributes can become qualified and manifested in particular forms, as particular things in the cosmos. These archetypes, you could say, or particular objects of knowledge in God's mind, are the Ayan al-Thabita, or the immutable entities. They exist there always in God's knowledge as the infinite possibilities determined by the names and attributes. And when God wants to create something, he simply gives or lends existence or being to that immutable entity like you would pour water into a vessel. Importantly, in this metaphor, the water, being wujud or existence, always remains one and unchanged, because being is identical to God, and God never changes or, becomes bigger or smaller. God just remains always what he is. He remains one without change. But this water, when it is poured into a vessel, it is formed according to that vessel that it is poured into. And so the vessel is the immutable entity in God's knowledge, and when he gives existence to it, it's like you pour the water into the vessel. Right? So being is the very reality of that thing, but being, without water itself being changed or formed, it sort of takes the shape of that particular vessel. So that's what's going on when God creates something, when he gives existence to these immutable entities, which are in themselves non-existent. Now, you may think this is similar to Plato's world of forms, and there are certainly similarities here, but also key differences. Unlike Plato's forms, the entities, the Ayan al-Thabita, are the things that exist in the manifest world, and in particular form, as opposed to being only archetypes that the existing things are emulating, like in Plato. In this way, the Ayan al-Thabita always remain non-existent too. Because they never have being of their own, they can only serve as the receptacles of God's being, the particular ways that the being of the real shows itself at that particular moment. So when we do read the Quranic statement that, quote, whichever way you turn, there is the face of God, this is read quite literally, and can be said to be true in two different ways. First of all, everything that is simply being, or wujud, the wujud of God. But that wujud is being qualified or manifests itself, or even veils itself in a way, through the immutable entities. But secondly, those immutable entities are also nothing but the reflections or particular manifestations of God's attributes. So it's all a divine display, the way that God can know or experience himself, but through another. Another that at the end of the day is nothing but God in a sense too. This is the essence of the idea of Wahdat al-Wujud that so many people have ascribed to Ibn Arabi, and which we see so unusually clearly espoused in this particular work. And the Sheikh likes to employ various different similes and metaphors to explain this concept, and a lot of these similes do show up already in this second chapter dedicated to the prophet Seth. One of the most prominent of these metaphors we've already mentioned, which is of course the one of the mirror. All the world is a mirror of God's attributes and being. Quote, "The world of nature consists of forms in a single mirror, nay, of one form in diverse mirrors." This tackles the exact same themes and portrays the perspectives of oneness versus multiplicity, or oneness versus duality. From the point of view of oneness, all things, that is, all diverse forms, are simply multiple forms reflected in a single mirror, that mirror being wujud, or the real. Whereas from the perspective of duality, one form, the real, is reflected in a multitude of mirrors, so the world of multiplicity in this case. As we saw earlier, this is also expanded to point out that because the very surface of the mirror is the wujud, or being of the real itself, we can never see the real, but only the reflections of the multiple things in the mirror. Quote, "Thereafter, the object of self-disclosure sees nothing but his own form in the mirror of the real. And it is not possible that he should see him, although he knows that it is only in him that he sees his own form. It is similar to what one finds in a visible mirror. When you see a form in it, you do not see it, the mirror, although you know that only there do you see forms, or your own form. Now God has manifested this in a similitude, employing it to represent the self-disclosure of the essence, so that the object of self-disclosure will know that he does not see him." And him he refers to the essence of God, right? There is no symbol which comes closer to or more closely resembles this vision and this self-disclosure. When you see a form in a mirror, struggle within yourself to see the body of the mirror, you will, without any doubt, never see it. A second metaphor that he uses talks about our own self-awareness as a likeness to the relationship between the one and the many. Remember, there is only God, and God remains one. But in order for God to know himself fully, an artificial duality must be created. Ibn Arabi says, quote, "The hidden says no when the manifest says I, and the manifest says no when the hidden says I. This is so with every opposite. The speaker is one and is the same as the listener. The Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, says, 'What their souls spoke. They speak and listen to their speaking, having knowledge of what their souls spoke. The identity is one while the determinations differ. There is no way of failing to know the likes of this, for every man knows this in himself. Each is a form of the real.'" I can know about myself, I can think about myself and even talk about myself, like I am a conscious being, for example, and inherit in that as a kind of paradox of duality versus oneness, because on the one hand, the one that I'm talking about is the same as the one talking, because I am talking about myself. So from one perspective of oneness, it's all just me. Whereas from another perspective of duality, there is a kind of duality created, an artificial duality created between the speaker and the spoken of, the knower and the known. Similarly, the world is God experiencing himself through another, that hidden treasure that loves to be known. Thus, there is a duality from one perspective, but a oneness from another. He also employs the simile of numbers in a fascinating way. He says, quote, "The determinations of numbers can appear only in what is numbered. What is numbered can have either non-existence or existence. The thing can be non-existent with respect to sense perception, while existent with respect to the intellect. It must needs be that there is number and what is numbered. Moreover, there must needs be the one which generates them. They are generated by means of it. Each level of number is a single reality. Take, for example, 9, 10, anything smaller, anything larger ad infinitum. None are a sum, but neither can any escape being called a grouping of ones. Indeed, 2 is a single reality, and there is a single reality no matter what level one reaches, even though they are one. So none of them are identical with any other. However, the fact of their being a grouping is predicated of them, and we speak of them in these terms, and it is judged to be present among them. All numbers are individual and have an identity of their own. 6 is not the same as 7, and neither are identical with 1, and they are considered as units of their own. But at the same time, all numbers is nothing but 1 or ones. So that 2 is really 1 plus 1, and 4 is just 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. The individual numbers are certainly different from one perspective, and different from all other numbers, which expresses the multiplicity of creation. But from another perspective, it is all 1, because they are made up of nothing but ones added upon each other. In the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, he develops the same idea too, where he adds a striking observation that if you remove 1 from any number, it ceases to be that number and thus loses its identity. So the very thing that makes that number unique and what it is the one that is hidden by virtue of the number's unique identity. This is another example of this idea that God veils himself with himself. It is the oneness that creates the duality and is the very essence of the identity of the multiple, so to say. And later in the chapter of Joseph, which naturally deals a lot with dreams and the alam al-khayal, or world of imagination, he uses other powerful similes regarding light. He uses 2 powerful similes here again to explain the situation, and both having to do with light. One is the metaphor of the world being the shadow of God. The surface that the shadow is cast upon are the Ayan al-Thabita, which shapes the shadow in different ways without the shadow itself becoming multiple in itself. And then both the light and the body that casts the shadow is, of course, the real. As we have to remember, though, from the ultimate perspective of oneness, it is all the real: light, body, and shadow. And he extends this metaphor into light shining through glass, too. If we see light on the other side of the glass, it will be colored based on the glass. In this case, he uses green as an example. From one perspective, it is correct to say that the light is green. This is sensory perspective, right? This is the perspective of the world as multiplicity as we experience it. We see a green light that shines through this glass. But it's also correct to say that the light has no color, which is the perspective of transcendence, God's transcendence, and that God is not like the world at all. So these 2 perspectives are always at play like this. A later poet from the school of Ibn Arabi, Fakhruddin Iraqi, builds on this theme very beautifully in his Lama'at, or Divine Flashes, expressing that the world is one light shining through many different vessels, taking different colors and shapes, but it is all the same one colorless light. It can indeed be pretty hard to talk about this stuff without simplifying or maybe misunderstanding it. And this is likely why Ibn Arabi uses a lot of these different metaphors and different ideas of expressing it to counteract those kinds of simplified perspectives. Indeed, if you just go into this reading it without having a broader understanding of Ibn Arabi's ideas for Islamic metaphysics and theology and so on, it's very easy to conclude that Ibn Arabi teaches some kind of pantheism, or at least a more crude form of pantheism, which would be very inaccurate. In fact, another one of the most recurring themes that he returns to again and again throughout the text is the very important relationship between the perspectives of tanzih and tashbih, transcendence or difference, and immanence and similarity. And this becomes perhaps most clear in the 3rd chapter dedicated to Noah, where he explores the story about this ancient prophet in Surah 71 of the Quran, and how Noah in this story had trouble winning over the people because, according to Ibn Arabi, he emphasized tanzih or transcendence too much instead of balancing the 2 perspectives. What this essentially is saying is that some people view God as utterly transcendent and different from the world, particularly philosophers and rational theologians, whereas others view him as similar or immanent, which can lead to things like anthropomorphism and even pantheism, although Ibn Arabi doesn't use this term in this case, of course. And to Ibn Arabi, both of these perspectives are true, but they are also both false. God is certainly transcendent and is unlike anything in the world. He doesn't have a body or hands or anything that can be compared to things in the universe. There's a very definite difference between the 2. But at the same time, as we saw earlier, the world is nothing but the self-disclosure or display of the divine itself. It is all God. So somehow, both are true and both are false. And it is only through balancing the 2, looking at things with both eyes of reason, which sees transcendence, and the eye of intuition, which sees similarity, that we can get the full picture. And this becomes very well and famously expressed in one of the poems in this chapter. Ibn Arabi says, if you insist only on his transcendence, you restrict him. And if you insist only on his immanence, you limit him. If you maintain both aspects, you are right. An imam and a master in the spiritual sciences. Whoso would say he is two things is a polytheist, while the one who isolates him tries to regulate him. Beware of comparing him if you profess duality, and if unity, beware of making him transcendent. You are not he, and you are he, and you see him in the essences of things, both boundless and limited. Noah focused on the Furqan, which in Arabic comes from the root fa, ra, qaf, meaning to separate, thus representing transcendence, instead of Quran, which here is very interestingly read to be based on the three-letter root qaf, ra, nun, rather than the qaf, ra, ayn, which is usually how it is conceived. In Ibn Arabi's reading, the qaf, ra, nun root, this would mean something like binding together, so the opposite of farq, of separating. The Prophet Muhammad, on the other hand, was able to perfectly balance the two in the revelation that he was given, which is perfectly exemplified in one single verse, according to Ibn Arabi, which says, "Naught is there like unto his likeness." In Arabic, "Laysa kamithlihi shay'un." This sentence contains both sides within itself, within a single sentence. On a surface reading, it expresses transcendence by simply stating that there is nothing like God, but at the same time, it says that there is nothing like his likeness, mithlihi, which also expresses the similarity and immanence. This is a perfect example to show how deeply Ibn Arabi is always in conversation with the Quran and the Hadith, and the very unique and fascinating ways that he interprets and reads these texts. In some ways, the whole Fusus could be seen as a kind of commentary on the Quran. And this distinction between tanzih and tashbih, transcendence and immanence, and the way that he plays with and switches between these two in his expressions can be found all over his writings. He will often surprise you by first saying something that seems very, let's say, non-dualistic, but then the next moment he says the opposite. And reading him can be quite confusing in that way, unless you keep this essential balance and paradoxical apophaticism in mind. Both of these perspectives are always equally true and equally false. When he says something that comes off as very shocking and non-dualistic, one must always keep in mind that the opposite statement also hides behind the words, and vice versa, and how these two play off each other, so to say. But one of the things that are so unique about the Fusus is that, at least according to me, among the writings of the Sheikh, there is no other book that leans so heavily into the immanence and oneness perspective. Even for someone like me who has read quite a lot of his works, some statements in the Fusus come off as quite radical and shocking in their plainness. Just listen to this quote from the chapter of Idris or Enoch, which I think is one of the most clear statements on Wahdat al-Wujud in his entire output. He says, quote, "By virtue of existence, he is identical with existent things. Those things we call that which comes to be are exalted in their essence and are none other than he." Quite profound, right? There is nothing but the wujud of God, and in the sense that they exist, all things are, quote, none other than he. You can understand how people reading this, without keeping all the nuance and complexity in mind that we have just discussed, might easily misunderstand or get a very simplified impression of his doctrine. But of all the chapters in the Fusus, the one that hammers down on the message of oneness more than any other, I would argue, is the 10th chapter, dedicated to the Arab prophet Hud, famous for the story in the Quran about the people of Ad and the city called Iram of the Pillars. It's fitting that the name of this chapter is the ringstone of the wisdom of unity, a hadiyah, in the word of Hud, because it is really a tour de force of unitive expression. The Sheikh begins the chapter by commenting on the Quranic verse, "Verily my Lord is on a straight path." As you might be able to guess, he comes to the conclusion that because us as creatures that walk on the path to God are self-disclosures of God, from one perspective, God not only guides us on the path, but is ultimately also the one walking the path himself. Quote, "Everything other than the real is a crawling creature because each is possessed of a spirit. There is nothing that crawls on its own, it can only crawl by another. It crawls in a state of dependence upon him who is on the straight path, and indeed it is a path only in its being walked upon." This perspective of oneness is then beautifully also captured in a poem. Quote, "When creation bows to you, the real bows to you. If the real bows to you, then creation may not follow. Realize our words in him, for all I say is true. There is no existent thing in being that thou shalt see not able to speak. There is no creature whose identity thou shalt see, whose identity is not the real. Yet he is lodged within it, because of this are his forms containers." And the chapter continues in this very radical way. In a section where the Sheikh gets unusually philosophical, he explains in a very profound way how the nature of God's transcendence and boundlessness necessitates his becoming delimited, thus being the reality of all. He says, quote, "We are delimited things, as he describes himself employing nothing but limits. His saying there is not like unto him is also a limit, if we take the like to be extraneous and not for the purposes of the description. Whosoever is distinguished from a delimited thing is delimited by not being identical with that delimited thing. To be absolute beyond qualification is qualification. In the sight of one who possesses understanding, the absolute is qualified by being absolute. And if we consider the like to be part of the description, we delimit him. If we take not as their like unto his likeness as the negation of likeness, then we will have realized through this idea and the authentic sayings that he is identical with things. Things are delimited, though their limits are diverse. He is delimited through the limit of every delimited thing. No thing is limited without this being the limit of the real. He flows in all things that bear the name created and originated. If the matter were not so, existence would not be a fact. He is identical with existence." Because God is unlimited and absolute, to say that he couldn't delimit himself, that he couldn't limit himself in some way, is to put a limit on God. Then he wouldn't be unlimited or absolute. There's one quote in there that is particularly striking in that he says, "Whosoever is distinguished from a delimited thing is delimited by not being identical with that delimited thing." The conclusion thus being that God must delimit himself and must in some way, although not other ways, be identical with things, or he wouldn't be unlimited. This reminds us, or at least me, of the expressions of the medieval Catholic mystic Meister Eckhart, who expresses himself in rather similar ways about God and being. He argues that being is distinct precisely by being indistinct. It is different from all things by the fact that it is the only thing that is identical to all things. I do sense a kind of similar line of philosophical argument here in the Sheikh. In fact, while the essence of God remains perfect without need of other things and without ever changing as such, on the level of his names, there needs to be a creation, right? He needs to create the universe in order to be complete. Because if God is the creator, what sense does that name and attribute make if there is nothing created for him to be creator over? If he is the merciful, that name has no meaning unless there is something else over which his mercy can be extended. This is well explored in the chapter of Abraham, who is often called Khalilullah, or friend of God, and this becomes an expression of this relationship between God and the world, in that it is a relationship of reciprocal friendship, where we as creation are constantly in need of God to give us existence, but God is also in some strange way dependent on us for his names to have a place of manifestation and for their function to be carried out. Now keep in mind that this dependency is only on the level of the names and not the essence. The essence remains completely independent and unchanged, but this becomes a reality when this relationship between this relative relationship between creator and creation comes into being, right? This as God delimits himself, this becomes relevant, whereas in God's very essence itself, these questions don't make any sense. And to return then to the chapter on Hud, this oneness is expressed, as you can see, in various different ways, hammering home that there really is only God. And toward the end of the chapter, the Sheikh does a kind of mic drop with a very profound poem that summarizes these ideas. فَهُوَ الْكَوْنُ كُلُّهُ وَهُوَ الْوَاحِدُ الَّذِي قَامَ كَوْنِي بِكَوْنِهِ وَلِذَا قُلْتُ يَغْتَدِي فَوُجُودِي غِذَاؤُهُ وَبِهِ نَحْنُ نَحْتَدِي فَبِهِ مِنْهُ إِن نَظَرْتَ بِوَجْهِ تَعَوَّذِي. He is all of being, and he is the one in whose being my being resides. Because of this I have said he feeds, from my existence is his nourishment, and we follow his example, in him and from him. If you so contemplate this, from one aspect, I do seek my refuge. This is in the translation of Dali, which is very beautiful, but if we look at the actual Arabic, things are even more radical than they may seem. When the Sheikh says he is all of being, in another translation by Austin it's he is all of becoming, we might think he means the word wujud for being here, right? Which, while pretty striking, wouldn't be all that surprising given what we have said so far. We know that, there is only one being, or one wujud, which is God, and that all other things are non-existent and only serve as the loci of God's wujud, the vessels in which the water is poured in the metaphor, and so on. But here, Ibn Arabi says, فَهُوَ الْكَوْنُ كُلُّهُ, thus using the word kawn, which also means existence or being, but in a more specific way. When Ibn Arabi uses the word wujud and its related terms, he's referring to being or existence more generally, right? It can mean the being of God or the being of created things, depending on the context that he is using it in, right? But the word kawn and its different forms is basically exclusively used to refer to existence or being in terms of the universe, right? The created universe, created things. So what the Sheikh expresses in this poem, especially through his word use, is quite radical in that way. He is all of being, all of kawn in terms of being, right? There is only God. This is one of the most radical expressions in the book because of the word that he uses in this poem, kawn rather than wujud. But again, all this talk about oneness and similarity is only one side of the coin. Ibn Arabi is famous for this idea of the oneness of being, and so is perhaps most associated with expressions of unity and tashbih and similarity, which are certainly there. But arguably, when we look at his text, he arguably talks more about the reality of multiplicity than he does about oneness. The other side is equally important to Ibn Arabi. The Fusus is filled with statements about the reality of multiplicity and the world, and how this multiplicity expresses the underlying oneness of being, without ever being regulated to the status of a simple illusion or something like that. It is a dream in the mind of God, the alam al-khayal, or world of imagination, but multiplicity is real and interacts with oneness. In this way, Ibn Arabi is also very different from the various quote-unquote Gnostic systems in antiquity, which saw the physical world as evil or as a dirty prison to be escaped. Ibn Arabi very strongly disagrees. To him, as we've seen, the world is a beautiful manifestation of the divine attributes, an expression and self-disclosure of the divine self and of wujud. In another work by Ibn Arabi, the Ittihad al-Kawni, he finds himself discoursing with 4 birds sitting in a universal tree. The last of these birds, a black crow, represents the universal body or the material world, and it's made clear that those who reject this physical aspect of reality are seriously mistaken. The crow in this text says, quote, "Some, alleging to be endowed with unshakable reason, made their claim and imposed their dubious judgment. They showered me with unseemly derision and divested me of the robe of seemly praise. But the evil consequences of their actions will turn against them, and their mocking will encompass them when, in the depths of my hell, they will call for help and be answered, 'Be gone therein and speak not unto me.' While in the breadth of my paradise, those who praise me well will make merry with their spouses in a garden made joyful. The law has already praised me, so what do I care? The received text has made clear my rank, so why say more?" It's a pretty harsh criticism of those who deny the nobility of the physical world, basically saying that they will go to hell for doing so, right? So this is very different from those kinds of Gnostic systems or perhaps extreme forms of asceticism and sometimes even extreme forms of monism, where the world of multiplicity, because one emphasizes the reality of oneness so much that multiplicity becomes a kind of illusion, that this physical world of the illusion is something to be turned away from. And this is only true from a certain sense, as we will see, but from another perspective, this is very This is an inaccurate way to see the world according to Ibn Arabi. The world should be seen as this beautiful manifestation, expression of the divine attributes, right? So this is very important. Of course, his mystical Sufi practice involved things like asceticism in order to control things related to the nafs, or the ego, the self. And the world in that sense is seen as dangerous in the way that it can lure you in through things like power, greed, lusts, sensory pleasures, and things like this. But seen in itself, the world is a beautiful and even divine thing. So you will hear Sufis and Ibn Arabi talk about the dunya, the world, as something that should be neglected, right? But there's a difference often between dunya on the one hand and alam, right? So dunya is not, it's translated as the world, but usually it doesn't mean the world as in the more general sense. It means the world as in worldliness, right? Being attached to things in the world that our ego seeks, for example, like what I mentioned, like money and greed and power and uncontrolled sensory pleasures and things like this. But that's dunya, whereas alam is the more general term for the world, right? And the world in itself, just in itself as such, is not an evil thing. Whereas when he talks about dunya in terms of these things, that is what's dangerous and that is what should be fought against on this mystical path. And that's a pretty important difference. This is given pretty beautiful expression in the Fusus, as Ibn Arabi expresses that all things are ultimately good and that God's mercy encompasses all things. The attribute of God that is primarily responsible for giving existence is ar-Rahman, or the merciful, and the giving of mercy, or rahma in Arabic, is identical to giving existence. Now, to understand what he is saying here properly, it's worthwhile to look at the Arabic word again. The English translation of rahma, mercy, can be pretty unsatisfactory to a lot of people. My friend once said that it reminded him of like video games like Mortal Kombat, where showing mercy is something related to, you know, an oppressive person who chooses against his will to be merciful, right? So it has these more negative, it's not negative association itself, but it reminds you of those kinds of associations, right? But the word rahma in Arabic is a lot more profound in meaning than that. Perhaps most importantly here, it has the same root, the Arabic linguistically, it has the same root as the word for womb, thus carrying meanings of motherly, caring love rather than the usual connotations for the word mercy in English. When we talk about mercy, we see this, at least me, maybe that's not true for all of you, but when someone says mercy, I see this king sitting on some throne and deciding to have some people executed, other people he shows mercy to. Like, that's the association with mercy, whereas rahma has this, in Arabic, has this association with the womb, with motherly love and care, like loving kindness, that kind of thing, which is very different. So the word mercy is not always a great translation, and sometimes I just like to use the Arabic rahma instead. But when I say mercy here, you should keep these connotations in mind. So when God extends rahma over all things, we should see it more as this caring love, this motherly love. In fact, to Ibn Arabi, all things are encompassed by mercy, by the very fact that it exists, and mercy or love is the end of all things. God's mercy overrides his wrath, as he likes to quote, meaning that rahma is always primary. All things are love in this way. He says, quote, "The straight path is God's, manifest and unconcealed for all, in the small and in the great is his very self. In the man ignorant of things, in the knower. Because of this does his mercy encompass everything from the meager to the grand." The Shaykh often talks about the nafas ar-Rahman, the breath of the All-Merciful, as the existentiating action of the real. God breathes the cosmos into existence, and that very breath, the sort of substance of that breath in this metaphor, is that mercy which all things are made from. But this very central idea about love or mercy or rahma extends to other significant ideas of the Shaykh. Indeed, it becomes very relevant for his conception of our ultimate fate in the afterlife. Because God's mercy is always prioritized over his wrath, this means that the end destination for everyone is a return to that mercy and love that is at the core of existence. In other words, Ibn Arabi very famously argues that the suffering that sinners experience in hell will be temporary. Now, what does he mean here exactly? He discusses this topic in a number of places, including in the chapters on Ishmael and Hud. And in the former, he talks about it in a poem, where he says, quote, "Nothing remains but the one, true to his promise. The threat of the real has no identity to be seen. Though they enter the abode of suffering, they have pleasure therein and clear enjoyment. The enjoyment of eternal gardens, the reality is one. Difference arises between them upon self-disclosure. It is called punishment because of the sweetness of its food. It is to it as a husk, and the husk protects." Here, the Sheikh is playing with the fact that in Arabic, the word for punishment and the word for sweetness has the same root, Ayn dal ba, to come to his conclusions. What he's saying here really follows the previous line of thought that mercy is one of God's primary attributes, and that his mercy always supersedes his wrath. Furthermore, Ibn Arabi points out that according to the Quran, God must keep his promises of reward, but there's nothing that says that he has to follow up on his threats. Right? So when he promises paradise to those who do good, he must keep that promise. But when he threats people, when he threats sinners that they will go to hell after death, he doesn't have to keep that threat in the same way that he has to keep his promises of reward. This is different from the school of the Mu'tazila, for example, which was a prominent Islamic school, especially in early Islam, which argued in a quite different way that the punishment or the fate of people in the afterlife is basically set. There's nothing you can do about it, right? God can't show you mercy despite the fact you're a sinner. The Prophet can't intercede on the Day of Judgment for you. You are sort of bound to the justice based on what you have done in life, right? But in this theology, God's mercy always ends up on top, right? God's mercy always comes first, and God has to keep his promises, but he doesn't have to follow through on his threats, right? So that's an interesting theological discussion in that way. And because everything always returns to rahmah, to mercy, this also includes the fate of those suffering in hell. Some people will go to the fire, for sure, and Ibn Arabi actually agrees that if you go to hell, you will stay in hell for eternity, right? So he doesn't say that our stay in hell is temporary. What he is saying is that the suffering that souls experience in hell, that suffering is temporary, and eventually that suffering will end and will turn to a sweetness. Hell is essentially a distance from God, and it is the knowledge about what you are missing, so to say, what you're missing out on, that is the most painful. But eventually, those in the fire will realize that even the fire is part of the reality of the real. That too is a self-disclosure of God. And then the fire will become a pleasure to them. In the chapter on Hud, it's made even more clear. He says, quote, "Among the slaves of God are those who will be seized by the suffering in the life of the hereafter, in the abode called hell. None amongst the folk of knowledge, those who unveil the affair as it is, deny that they shall have an enjoyment particular to them in that abode. Either the pain they were experiencing shall be lifted from them, their enjoyment consisting of the relief from the consciousness of that pain, or they shall have a separate and independent enjoyment of the folk of paradise within paradise, and God knows best." All of reality, as we can see, is a display not only of the divine generally, but particularly of mercy or rahmah and of love. Everything comes from love, everything consists of love, and everything returns to love. This theme is beautifully explored in the chapter on Moses, which is a long ta'wil or esoteric interpretation of the story of the Exodus and the longest chapter in the Fusus. In one section, Ibn Arabi makes the profound statement that everything is based on love. Even those things we wouldn't associate with love are really only its backside. It is because of love that God gives existence to the immutable identities, and it is because of love for perfection that we act in our lives. Everything we do and feel is based on love in an inward sense, even though outwardly we may say that it is for another reason. This is exemplified by Moses fleeing from Egypt out of fear for the Pharaoh. Now this is the outward sense, but inwardly, fleeing out of fear is nothing other than fleeing out of love to preserve one's life. So fear is like the shadow of love. Similarly, feelings of hate only stem from love too, because you only hate that which offends what you love. Love is the essence of every reality and every action. Quote, "Were it not for this love, the world would not have been manifest in his identity. Its motion from non-existence into existence is the motion of the existentiator's love for it. The world also loves to witness itself in existence as it did in immutability. In every respect, its motion from immutable non-existence into existence is a motion of love from the side of the real and from its own side. Perfection is beloved in itself." He later also says, quote, "Motion is always the motion of love, but one who sees it veils it with other occasions." And later still, "Thus it is established that motion belongs to love, for there is no motion in being that is not that of love." When he says motion here, he means not physical motion in space, he means anything that happens, right? Any motion in reality, anything we do, anything we think, everything that happens, basically. And this also leads to an interesting discussion about the ways that prophets speak to the people, right? Based on this idea of the outer and the inner, right? That everything is love, that is the fact that everything and every motion is the motion of love, that is the underlying reality, the esoteric aspect, and the outer reality is all these other reasons that we act while we do. That is, in terms of Moses, the outward action is that he fled out of fear, whereas the inward is that it was love. And this becomes a lesson in how prophets speak to the general masses of people. The revelation that they are given is a revelation that aims to speak to as many people as possible, and therefore it speaks mostly in terms of the outer sense. It talks about Moses fleeing out of fear, whereas the Gnostics, the Arifun, the mystics, right, those who can see beneath the surface, who can see reality for what it is, they can see this more hidden esoteric aspect, which is that everything is love. The two sort of levels to in this case, to revelation, for example. But this love isn't just some abstract, cozy thing, right? Love is enacted. Understanding that love is the essence of things leads us to act according to love. To love God, of course, just as he loves us, but also to love our fellow human beings, our fellow creatures, and all aspects of this reality. In the chapter on Jonah, we get some really beautiful ethical expressions in that vein. He states that even in legal circumstances, one should always do one's best to choose mercy, to pardon rather than to punish, and to not retaliate when someone hurts you. He says, quote, "Do you not see him saying, the recompense of evil is evil the like of it? He made retaliation an evil, meaning that the act is evil even though it is prescribed. But whoso pardons and put things right, his wage falls upon God, for he is his image. Whosoever pardons someone and refrains from killing him will have his wage fall upon he whose image he is. Such is more worthy, for he made him for himself. He is only manifest through the name the manifest by means of his existence, so whoever guards him guards the real." This is a very profound statement, but also a natural extension of his general metaphysics. All things are quote-unquote images of God. The whole world is the manifestation of God, including your fellow creature. So to care for your neighbor is to care for God, in a sense. Charity and a loving relationship with the world around you thus becomes a very profound metaphysical practice. This inevitably reminds us, or at least me, of the famous quote that we find both in the Gospel of Matthew, in the New Testament of the Bible, and in a hadith in the Islamic tradition. They are almost identical in their wording. Quote, "O son of Adam, I fell ill, and you visited me not. Did you not know that my servant so-and-so had fallen ill, and you visited him not? Did you not know that had you visited him, you would have found me with him? O son of Adam, I asked you for food, and you fed me not." As you can see, all the different aspects of Ibn Arabi's thought really make up a complex but coherent whole, where all things sort of make sense within the larger framework, and where everything is also deeply connected to and in conversation with the Quran and the Hadith literature. It is an incredibly sophisticated and impressive metaphysical scheme or framework, right? Regardless if you think it is heretical or if you love it, right? You can't deny that there is an incredible coherence and sophistication to Ibn Arabi's, or at least the Akbari, system of thought. It's really incredible stuff, and it really comes through so clearly and so radically in the Fusus in particular. And this also leads us to another one of the most famous and, again, controversial teachings of Ibn Arabi, and one of the most prominent themes in the Fusus, namely that concept which today is often referred to as the Divinity of Beliefs. This is an idea that is expressed in one of the most widely quoted sections in the book, and which comes at the end of the chapter on Hud. Quote, "Beware lest you bind yourself with a specific belief and reject others, for much good will escape you. Indeed, the knowledge of reality as it is will escape you. Be then within yourself a hayula, matter, for the forms of all belief. For God is too vast and too great to be confined to one belief to the exclusion of another. For indeed he says, wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of God. He did not mention one wheresoever as opposed to another." Now there's a lot going on in this quote. As we saw in the beginning, the essence of God can never be known. As human beings and created things, we can never know God as he truly is. He's simply too transcendent for any mind to grasp. But God discloses himself to us in various different forms. Indeed, this whole reality is, again, the self-disclosure of God. And as human beings with different constitutions, different Ayan, or immutable entities, our preparedness means that we will only receive God in a certain way. Here, Ibn Arabi uses a quote by the earlier Sufi master Junayd of Baghdad, who said that the water takes on the color of the cup. To Ibn Arabi, this means that God shows himself or discloses himself to different people in different ways depending on their innate preparedness. You've probably heard that famous quote that if a cow worshipped a god, that god would look very different from how we humans conceive of God. I see this as a kind of extension of a similar idea. In fact, we all create our own gods that we worship, even monotheists and iconoclastic traditions like Muslims and Islam. Quote, "At all events, it must be that each individual be possessed of a belief regarding his Lord, by means of which he returns to him and within which he seeks after him. The real discloses himself to him within it and acknowledges it. If he disclosed himself to him as something else, he would deny it and seek refuge from it, and would in reality be showing bad adab with him." Adab means manners, basically. "One only believes in a divinity through what he has made within his own soul. The divinity of beliefs comes about through this making. They see not but their own souls and what they have made therein." In reality, in a way, everyone worships themselves and the creation of their own soul, as the way that God discloses himself to that particular person, thus being that particular person's Lord, Rabb. And because everything is actually the manifestation of God, and there is nothing but God, all these divinities that we worship are actually true. There is nothing that we can worship that is not God. In fact, Ibn Arabi here interprets the Quranic verse, "Your Lord has decreed that you worship none but him," to literally mean that you cannot worship anything but God, because there is nothing but God. In fact, all the beliefs and creeds about God are correct, but all of them are also incorrect. God transcends all beliefs. No one belief can encompass God, but he encompasses all beliefs. Now, this does not mean that Ibn Arabi is a relativist in terms of religion or teaches some kind of pluralism. He is very firmly a Muslim who believes that Islam is the true religion to be followed. Muhammad was the last prophet, the Quran is the last revelation, the law of the Sharia, of the Islamic religion, is the way to live in the world. That is the correct way to live in the world, right? So he is very clearly a Muslim. Some kind of pluralism, religious pluralism, is not what he is getting at here. Now, he would argue that even if you worship a rock or even a statue, you are indeed worshipping God, but to do so is bad adab, or bad manners toward God, because God has explicitly asked us not to worship any images. So it is sinful in that way, even if it is metaphysically true. And furthermore, this is only on the physical level. Because even if you don't worship God in the form of physical things or images, you are still creating that idol or image in your mind or in your soul about God and worshipping that God of your own creation. This simply cannot be escaped. But to understand the full implications of this teaching, we also need to look at the microcosmic level and the human heart, so beautifully explored in the important chapter dedicated to the Prophet Shu'aib. The heart, or qalb, is the spiritual center of the human being. It is here, and not in the intellect or the mind, that we can truly encounter God. And when we get down to it, the human heart, because it is a reflection of the infinity of the attributes, is itself infinite and boundless, an ocean without any shore. A person who has reached the station of no station, who has accomplished the goal of becoming the insan al-kamil, his or her heart has become so vast that it is an ocean without a shore, which can take on all forms, as he says in his very famous poem. Here he uses a quote from Bistami and elaborates himself that even if the throne of God itself and all that it encompasses, thus the entire cosmos, if all that would appear in the heart 100,000 times, he would not even notice it. That is how vast the heart is. Quote, "If all that God created were in my heart, its luminous dawn would not appear. Whosoever encompasses the real is not confined by creation." The heart is always fluctuating. The word heart, or qalb, actually comes from a word literally meaning turning in Arabic. So it's always turning, it's always in motion, fluctuating, and it's shaped by what it encompasses, so to say. And because the human heart is boundless in this way, it is the only thing in reality that can encompass God. As the famous hadith says, "Neither my earth nor my heavens could contain me, but the heart of my believing servant does contain me." The more we, quote, polish the mirror of our heart, removing all stains of ego and limitation, the more perfectly God can be reflected in that mirror of the heart. The human being in potential has a heart that encompasses all things, and even the real in a complete sense. But most people aren't that way, of course. The regular person's heart only encompasses and takes the form of his particular Lord, the divinity of his particular belief. Now let's look at that very famous quote again. "Beware lest you bind yourself with a specific belief and reject others, for much good will escape you. Indeed, the knowledge of reality as it is will escape you. Be then within yourself a hayula, a matter for the forms of all belief, for God is too vast and too great to be confined to one belief to the exclusion of another." He says here that we are to be a hayul, a hayula for the forms of all beliefs. Now, hayula in Arabic means matter, and this connects to Aristotelian teachings about matter as a pure receptacle that receives and takes on forms. He's saying here that we, our heart, should be like that matter. To be a knower means to not be limited by any particular beliefs, but to see all beliefs and all things as the divine display. This discussion on the encompassment of the heart is key to understanding Ibn Arabi's most famous poem, where he says, "My heart has become capable of every form." The heart takes the form of preparedness for receiving or witnessing a particular quote-unquote form of God in the infinity of ways that he can become manifested. Every person has a particular belief concerning God based on their preparedness, and their heart quote-unquote takes the shape of that belief. Just like the hayula or matter takes on form, matter being passive and then sort of being shaped by form, right? This is the same way that the heart works according to Ibn Arabi. But the heart of the realized Gnostic, the Arif, is the heart that encompasses the real absolutely, including all its manifested forms and all its qualifications. It thus takes on the form of all things. Quote, "The real of what is believed is that whose form is encompassed by the heart." So when he says in his famous poem, لَقَدْ صَارَ قَلْبِي قَابِلًا كُلَّ صُورَةٍ, my heart has become capable of every form, and then after that listing a bunch of things, like the pasture for the gazelles, the cloister for the monks, the temple for the idols, etc. This expresses a view of reality where the heart can encompass the real and where all things in the world are seen as nothing other than him, as the self-disclosure of his reality and of the oneness of being. This is therefore not a defense of idol worship, but rather a natural extension of his wider metaphysics, which are always understood in tandem with and under the basic requirements and restrictions of the Islamic religion. All things are the self-disclosure of God. Everything is alive, even things that we consider to be dead, like rocks or this floor or trees are considered to be alive. Anything in the world, everything is alive. Minerals are alive. Everything is alive, and everything is continually praising God. Even straws of grass blowing in the wind or waves on the ocean dancing back and forth, it's all singing the praises of God, even though we can't hear their particular language. Quote, "Just as the manifest form of man praises its spirit and its governing soul with its tongue, so too did God make the forms of the world to glorify with his praises, although we do not understand their glorification, since we do not whole grasp the forms of the world. They are all tongues of the real, and so speak the praises of the real. For this reason God says, 'Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds.' That is, the culmination of all praise stems from him. He thus gives praise and is praised." He makes a quite radical and profound claim here too. Namely that as all things are praising God, at the end of the day, it is all God that is praising himself. He gives praise, and he is praised, as he wrote. The hidden treasure that loved to be known becomes known through the creation of another, but that duality is only on the surface. We are really God knowing himself through us. And when we praise God, that is, from one perspective, God praising himself through us. And he mentions here the Quranic phrase and the very common prayer in Islam, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, praise be to God, Lord of the worlds. And what he means with that in particular is further elucidated in that other major work of his, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, or the Meccan Revelations. In that work, he interprets this phrase in classic Akbari fashion in similar ways as he worked with other quotes that we have talked about in this episode. Looking at the word Alhamdulillah, there are two levels to it. The obvious surface meaning is Alhamdulillah, right? All praise belongs to God. That is, all praise is to be directed at God. He is the only one worthy of such praise. But looking closer at the Arabic, there's another reading hiding here too. Alhamdulillah. The praise belongs to God, in the sense that the praise is God's. That is, it is God that is the praiser. So he gives praise and is praised in a single act of praising. This is why we love these mystics and their interpretations of scriptures, right? It's really hard to choose what to talk about when it comes to this text because every page, every paragraph, there's so much fascinating stuff that we could talk about for half an hour, right? So, but as a kind of final thing, we should probably explore what is maybe the most controversial aspect or part of this whole book. And it's not what you might expect. It's not these ideas about the oneness of being or these unitive expressions or anything like that. Rather, what is arguably the most controversial part of this book is Ibn Arabi's statements about the faith of the Pharaoh in the story of Moses. So in the story about Moses and the Pharaoh, as most of us know, the latter is killed when the Red Sea sort of returns to itself and the Pharaoh and his army drown in the sea. And just before he dies, the Pharaoh repents and asks God for mercy. Now, the majority of Muslim commentators and scholars see this repentance as invalid. The Pharaoh only turned to God because he knew he was dying and wanted to save himself at the last moment. He is still destined to spend eternity in hell, in other words. But Ibn Arabi disagrees. In a way, the arguments here are also a continuation of the ideas about mercy, that the priority of mercy over all other things, but there is also more to it. In fact, the Sheikh argues that the Pharaoh actually wasn't entirely sure that he was dying at the moment of his repentance, which means that it was, after all, valid. He says, quote, "Thus Pharaoh was killed, despite his sudden faith, which would also have been the case if he had been certain of dying in that moment. The evidence, however, indicates that he was not certain, since he watched the believers walking along the dry path that had appeared when Moses struck the sea with his staff. Thus, when he believed, Pharaoh was not certain of destruction, unlike the dying man who only believes so that death might not touch him." He believed as the children of Israel believed, although he was falsely certain that he would be saved from destruction. What he was certain of occurred, but in a form other than that he had wished for. God saved him from the punishment of the hereafter in his soul, and also saved his body, or his corpse. In general, the character of the Pharaoh is very interesting throughout the whole chapter. There's a long section that is an amazing example of Quranic ta'wil, or esoteric interpretation, of the conversation between Moses and Pharaoh, where it becomes clear that the Pharaoh knows the truth about God and reality the whole time, but he purposely hides that truth for his own gain. And the way that Ibn Arabi interprets this conversation is just so fascinating. You should definitely go read this chapter if you're interested in mystical interpretation of scripture in general. This conversation between Moses and the Pharaoh in the Great Hall, you know, when he turns the staff into a snake and all that. Ibn Arabi's interpretation of that conversation is really interesting. Finally, in the last chapter dedicated to the word of Muhammad, Ibn Arabi gives us some really interesting and sometimes surprising statements about our relationship to reality. Indeed, as he has been alluding to throughout the text, God is the hidden essence behind all things, being veiled by the multiplicity of the manifest world. But at the same time, that veil or multiplicity is also God. God veils himself with himself. And the ultimate goal, in a sense, is not to reach oneness with God and to be annihilated. This is an important step on the way, for sure. As you probably know, the ideal of fana, or annihilation, is often portrayed as the goal of Sufism, and it is a central theme, for sure. When the mystic is able to annihilate his self or ego, the nafs, he becomes nothing, and there is simply God experiencing God in the absolute oneness of divinity. But this is only half of the story. Only a step on the way and not the full picture. Because the world of multiplicity is also part of being. It is an essential part of oneness. So after fana comes baqa, or subsisting in God, when one returns to the world and our individuality with a newfound understanding of things. And here we find ourselves at the ultimate stage of not seeing God as the hidden essence behind the veil of multiplicity, but of seeing God in the veil. To truly know that wherever you turn, there is the face of God, a oneness even in multiplicity. And the chapter in the word of Muhammad in some ways deals with this aspect. At the core of the chapter is a statement by the Prophet Muhammad that three things were made worthy of special love to him: prayer, perfume, and women. And Ibn Arabi interprets all three of these in fascinating ways. A large chunk of the chapter is in fact spent praising femininity in some beautiful ways. He criticizes men who approach their wives sexually only for the sake of their own lust and sensual pleasure, not realizing the divinity that is inherent in the feminine manifestation and the reciprocal relationship between the two. Indeed, he even says the fullest way to experience God, the most perfect way to experience God, is through a woman. Quote, "Witnessing the real in women is the greatest and most perfect witnessing." Now that's a pretty radical statement. What is going on here? In Ibn Arabi's view of the world, the relationship between masculine and feminine is very important. And to him, just like in the wider Aristotelian and Western tradition, the masculine is associated with the active principle and femininity with the passive. Now, this doesn't have to be connected with a particular human sex or gender, but represents wider principles in the world that can change depending on the context, but which are, of course, on the human level, represented by the male and female sex. All of the world, on all levels, consists of this relationship between male and female, active and passive. And the first example of this is the very first thing that God creates. The intellect, or aql, is the masculine to the feminine world soul, nafs al-kuliyya. But on the level below that, it is the soul that is the masculine to the level below it, which is nature. So you can see that these identities change depending on the context, but remain very important nonetheless, right? So one principle or aspect of reality that is feminine in one context or circumstance becomes the masculine in another circumstance, right? But this principle of masculine, feminine, active, passive is present at all levels in different ways of reality. It's very important to his wider system, so to say. Heaven is masculine and earth is feminine, etc. And it is the coming together of the masculine and the feminine that creates a child, so to say. So on all levels, you have the masculine, the feminine, and when they come together, they create something new. And this happens on all these different levels. And this principle of these three, this relationship, rules all of the world, you could say. Rain that falls from heaven fertilizes the earth and plants are born. Right? So rain comes from heaven, the masculine falls to the passive feminine earth, and then the child of a plant is born. This is just one example. So the whole world is this coming together of masculine and feminine and the fruits that result from it. And on the human level, this of course becomes very obvious in the relationship between man and woman. The two are drawn toward each other because they complete each other. And the ultimate desire of the man for the woman, and vice versa, is to become united in the sexual act, representing the culmination of that love, when the active and the passive come together, which also represents the union of the lover and the divine beloved in mystical union. In the sexual act, the active and passive become one, and thus we can see ourselves mirrored in each other. The active principle of the masculine as well as the passive principle of the feminine comes together, and we thus get a complete picture of the human reality and how it relates to the divine, acting as a mirror and a manifestation. It is for this reason that the best way to experience God is through a woman, as he says, and perhaps especially through the sexual act, through sex, as long as it is approached from the right holistic perspective and not simply for fleshly desire, right? The Sheikh says, quote, "When man witnesses the real in woman, it is a witnessing in a passive thing. When he witnesses him in himself with respect to woman's manifesting from him, he witnesses him in an active thing. When he witnesses him in himself without the presence of any form that has been existentiated out of him, he is witnessing only something that is passive, without intermediary in relation to the real. Thus, his witnessing him in woman is more complete and more perfect, since he witnesses the real with respect to being both active and passive. In himself, it is only with respect to his being passive. That is why the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, loved women, owing to the perfection of his witnessing the real in them, since the real is never witnessed separate from matter, for the essence of God is beyond the need of the worlds. Now, since it is impossible in that respect, and since witnessing can only take place in a matter, witnessing the real in women is the greatest and most perfect witnessing." A powerful statement. He then also further explains the other two things that were loved by the Prophet. Prayer is pretty obvious, and he has some beautiful things to say about prayer. And then perfume seems to me to represent the breath of the All-Merciful that we mentioned earlier, right? So thus all of creation in a sense. But since perfume is pleasant smells in particular, he might be referring to goodness here. That perfume, that the Prophet loved perfume, is that the Prophet loved goodness in the world. This is my interpretation, at least my reading of this section. Finally, Ibn Arabi ends the last chapter by returning to the theme of the divinity of beliefs, and that we are to know God in every form and in every belief. At the end of the day, we are back at that central paradox. He transcends all things and is utterly hidden, but at the same time is present in all things, indeed is all things. The very last paragraph is almost like an encouragement to the reader. Quote, "The divinity of beliefs is subject to limits, and this is the divinity encompassed by the heart of its slave. Indeed, the absolute divinity is not encompassed, for it is identical with things and with itself. Of a thing, one neither says that it encompasses itself, nor that it does not encompass itself. So understand. And God speaks the truth and guides the way." The Fusus al-Hikam is a work that leaves no reader unaffected, whether you see it as a beautiful expression of reality, if you take spiritual nourishment from it, if it's philosophically or academically interesting, or if you see it as completely heretical or blasphemous. No one is unaffected emotionally by this text. Everyone has very strong emotions about this text, I would say. And regardless of one's opinion about it, it's safe to say that this is one of the great masterpieces of mystical literature, not just in Islam and Sufism, but in the world more generally. In terms of Ibn Arabi's legacy, this work would become his probably most famous and notable. It is certainly the work that has received the largest amounts of commentaries across history. commentaries that often become important works in their own right and which try to elucidate the very difficult teachings of the greatest master. Ibn Arabi himself wrote a kind of summarizing commentary. His student Qunawi wrote a semi-commentary, but also Afif ad-Din Tilimsani, Abd al-Razak al-Qashani, and Dawood al-Qaisari, just within the first few generations of the Akbari school. Later on, there are significant commentaries by the likes of Abdurrahman Jami, Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi, several notable Ottoman intellectuals and scholars, the famous Algerian Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, whose Kitab al-Mawaqif is essentially a kind of commentary on the Fusus, and many others. It is, in other words, a classic and one of the most significant works in the history of Sufism and Islam. But while these commentaries and works mentioned are positive in their interpretation of the work, it has, as we've already said, also been a pretty controversial book. Because it is the one book by Ibn Arabi that, in my opinion at least, expresses his ideas in the most unfiltered and radical ways, it has often been the work that his critics point to in order to prove his status as a heretic, so to say. Famously, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Hanbali scholar and foundational figure of Salafism, Ibn Taymiyyah, is said to have been a fan of Ibn Arabi at first, admiring his works like the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, but again, when he read the Fusus, it shocked him so much that he completely changed his opinion and became one of Ibn Arabi's greatest critics. And even Sufi masters across the world will often forbid their students from reading the Fusus or Ibn Arabi generally until they have reached a certain level of spiritual attainment, because it is so advanced and so easy to misunderstand, right? It is a book with a very varied legacy, in other words. Some see it as one of the greatest books of mysticism in history, others as an expression of dangerous heresy. But we can't help but be fascinated and intrigued by its radical expressions, its metaphors, its the images that it paints, and the ways that he talks about some of these advanced and very profound ideas about reality and the oneness of all things, right? To read this book is really to go on a journey, and a journey that no one leaves unaffected. Thank you so much for watching this video. This was probably a very long one. It is a very long one. It was, in fact, the result of a poll or a sort of patron's choice. So on my Patreon page, I sometimes do polls, and I asked the patrons to vote for suggestions on what they wanted the next video to be, and the one that got the most votes was this right here, this video about the Fusus. So I hope both my patrons out there, who I'm very thankful for, but also all of you out there, enjoyed this deep dive into this incredibly difficult but very fascinating and beautiful in many ways work of mystical literature. Supporting me on Patreon is really the best way to support this channel of providing this kind of free educational content. So I would highly appreciate if anyone else wanted to become a patron. And as always, I am incredibly thankful for those who are currently supporting me. I will leave links to that in the description. You can also support by giving a one-time donation through PayPal, or it always just helps if you like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment under the video. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you want to follow my stuff, you can find me on my socials here. You can also find me on my other channel, Filip Holm, where I post music and music content. I actually have a new single, a new song coming out pretty soon. It's going to be in Swedish, called Good Old Stink. So keep an eye out for some new music coming soon, as well as new videos covering everything from yoga to Norse mysticism or Seder in the near future, hopefully. So hope to see you then, and yeah, I'll see you next time.